Countries around the world have borrowed staggering amounts of cash to try and limit the economic consequences of the pandemic. So where does a government borrow that money from, and can it ever be paid back? Most of a government's income typically comes from taxes, like the tax you pay on your income or things you buy in the shop. Sometimes a government ends up spending more than it receives, creating what's called a budget deficit. To plug the gap, it usually has to borrow money. Some years it can cover all of its spending from taxes, but because of the pandemic, many countries like Canada or Saudi Arabia have seen their budget deficits balloon. And in the UK, the coronavirus crisis has pushed borrowing to a post-war high. Although there were periods during the two world wars when it was significantly higher for longer. A deficit in any one year shouldn't be confused with overall debt, which is essentially a government's overdraft, the total amount of cash borrowed over many years but still outstanding. In the United States, for example, the national debt exceeded $28 trillion in March 2021. Those big numbers can sound really scary, but debt is usually expressed as a percentage of the size of the whole economy, its annual gross domestic product. On that measure, Japan has the largest debt in the world, at more than 2.5 times everything it produces, goods and services, in a year. But where does that money come from in the first place? Governments often borrow money from pension funds, banks, insurance firms, and even other countries by selling bonds. A bit like an IOU note, sometimes with interest. Repayment terms for these bonds can be as fast as 1 month or stretch over decades. To pay back what it owes, a country might borrow even more, cut spending on public services, or raise taxes to boost its income. But that can be difficult politically. It's often unpopular with voters. Faster economic growth could also come to the rescue, increasing government revenues through a boost in tax returns. Most governments choose not to pay it back. They just learn to live with higher levels of public debt. But that's not always possible if the interest rates on the debt are high. The huge amount of borrowing seen during the pandemic has also prompted calls for a wealth tax, like that introduced in Argentina, or even forgiving debts totally for some poorer countries. Borrowing during the pandemic to protect jobs and growth has been seen as an absolute priority for many countries, but in practice, very few governments ever pay off their debts in full.